O meu nome é Manuel Pinto, eu venho da Universidade de Minho e é o meu privilégio apresentar o conferencista que faz, digamos assim, o arranque, do ponto de vista dos debates desta sessão, deste congresso. Teremos uma metodologia em que o professor David Buckingham fará a intervenção de abertura durante cerca de 40 a 45 minutos e haverá depois curtíssimos comentários da parte do professor António Granado e de mim próprio. E se houver tempo, uma vez que nós estamos aqui com constrangimentos temporais e queremos dar tempo às comunicações livres, não é? Nós procuraremos, portanto, ser rigorosos neste controle do tempo e eu farei rapidamente uma breve apresentação dos nossos convidados. Antes disso, gostava de saudar também uma audiência que não está aqui presente, que é aquela que está, eventualmente, a acompanhar-nos através da internet. Este congresso está a ser transmitido em direto, pelo menos nas suas sessões plenárias, através da internet. E, já agora, queria agradecer também a todas as pessoas que estão a dar apoio, o staff, tradutores, etc., que estão também a ajudar-nos a que esta seja uma experiência de comunicação e a tradução desse ponto de vista é também importante. Bom, eu gostava de começar pelo professor António Granado, que é hoje professor de jornalismo, sobretudo ligado às questões de jornalismo e de multimédia na Faculdade de Ciências Sociais e Humanas da Universidade Nova de Lisboa. Tem uma grande trajetória como jornalista e muito ligado ao online, ao jornalismo online. Desempenhou funções e terminou a sua tarefa no Público, em particular, onde fez toda a sua carreira como editor do Público Online. Trabalhou depois alguns anos no jornalismo multimédia da RTP e hoje está praticamente dedicado ao seu trabalho como docente académico e investigador na Universidade Nova. É autor, e se calhar é um lado menos conhecido de muitos de vocês aqui, é autor de um dos mais antigos blogs portugueses, o Ponto Média, que revela, digamos assim, esta atenção que o António Granado sempre teve, uma atenção crítica relativamente à atualidade e, em particular, à atualidade do ciberjornalismo e do online em geral. O professor David Buckingham, bom, eu tenho o privilégio de eu acompanhar e de ele me ter, de alguma forma, guiado desde os meus inícios também, e quero começar por agradecer essa marca, digamos assim, essa orientação que ele foi fazendo, mesmo que não formalmente, mesmo que tenha sido informal, e fê-lo, com certeza, para muitos de nós que lemos os seus livros. Hoje é uma espécie de oportunidade de, cara a cara, podermos ouvi-lo e, eventualmente, mesmo que não o possamos fazer aqui em plenário, estamos a falar com ele nos corredores. Ele é hoje professor emérito da Universidade, que tem um nome terrível para pronunciar em português, Loughborough, creio que não disse assim uma grande barbaridade, no Reino Unido. Além disso, é professor visitante de uma instituição norueguesa, Norwegian Center for Child Research, que curiosamente teve uma importância grande através de um professor desse centro no lançamento dos trabalhos, por exemplo, da Sociologia da Infância, em particular na Universidade do Minho. Por outro lado, obviamente, quando nós pensamos no nome do professor David Buckingham, pensamos nos seus livros. Digamos, é o primeiro contacto que temos com ele. Ele é autor de cerca de 30 livros, eu diria que a uma média quase de um por ano, às vezes até mais do que um. Lembro-me de ter visto num ano, pelo menos, uns 2 livros. Mas este é um trabalho que não é um trabalho, digamos assim, produzido pela quantidade, é um trabalho que é assente numa quantidade impressionante de projetos de pesquisa com fundos diversos que de alguma forma deram origem depois a esse trabalho partilhado depois com a comunidade, não apenas de académicos, mas dos operacionais no terreno, porque muita desta investigação que o professor David Buckingham desenvolveu fê-lo com professores nas escolas, com crianças, em diferentes contextos de educação formal e não formal. Além disso, foi consultor de diversas organizações internacionais, como a Unesco, como a Comissão Europeia, como outras instituições do Sistema das Nações Unidas e também, digamos, instituições britânicas como o Governo do Reino Unido e também a entidade reguladora do Reino Unido, que é a Ofcom. E, bom, eu não gostava de prolongar muito esta apresentação do seu CV, porque nunca mais sairíamos daqui. Dava de imediato a palavra ao professor David Buckingham.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for the invitation to this pavilion of knowledge. It's a very grand and fancy place, I would say. Thank you also to the organisers for inviting me, and I shouldn't forget to thank the translators who will make all this possible. Okay, literacy, media, citizenship, technology, education, culture, politics. I spoke to Sarah and I said, can you tell me which aspect you would like me to speak about? And she said, well, everything. So I have 45 minutes. I always speak for too long, but I will try to keep to my 45 minutes. And what I want to talk about is really to this title, and I guess you will tell from my title that I also have a particular interest in children and young people. I think when we come to... Now, the question is, will the... Okay. When we come and talk about young people in this context, there's often the idea of a generation gap, that there has been a change in use of media, and that is manifested by differences in generations. So we have the idea, as in this kind of image, that somehow generations are defined by technology, the digital generation, the internet generation, the PlayStation generation. In Japan, they talk about the thumb generation, that children apparently have very powerful thumbs because of using the mobile and the game console. We have these related ideas: bionic kids, digital natives, cyborg babies. And the idea here is really that technology somehow defines what it means to be a person, that people who are growing up in this digital world are growing up to be different kinds of people. I want to start by questioning this, and as when I put this talk together, as I always do, I go on Google Images and I steal pictures. I mean, copyright, who cares about that? And I would like you, as I go through, to try and think about and to question some of the visual images as well. We find lots of these images, the child engages with technology and a world of wonder appears. Or alternatively, the child engages with the technology and some very powerful, harmful influence, almost pulling the child into the technology, into the digital world. When we talk about this, the debate, I think, is often very polarized and simplistic. On the one hand, we have the idea of the internet and digital media as a source of pornography, as a place where pedophiles run around, terrorists are seducing our children. And on the other hand, we have a story about liberation and empowerment, that these technologies will set young people free. We have a tendency to moral panic, and on the other side, we have a tendency towards utopian fantasy. And the public debate, and I think perhaps our own thinking, often shifts from one to the other in a very awkward way. It's got to be either one thing or the other. I think there is a problem, actually, with both sides of this debate. There's a danger that when we talk about young people, we construct them, we can define them in particular ways. We define them as super competent, or on the other hand as endangered, at risk. And I think the problem with both sides of that debate is that they tend to essentialize, they tend to overgeneralize about children and young people. There's almost a kind of what some writers have called an exoticism. You know, we define the child as somehow other, as somehow different from us. We see them as exotic and strange. And I think in all of this, often the idea of childhood and our fears and anxieties and also our hopes and wishes about childhood are connected with our concerns and anxieties about technology. So we have a mythology about the power of technology that plays into our ideas about childhood, ideas of children as innocent and vulnerable, or alternatively, ideas about children as spontaneously, naturally wise and knowing. And I think all of this is very sentimental and really, in the end, very unhelpful. It doesn't help us to understand what is going on in kids' interactions with technology. So my aim is partly to question and to tell you a rather different story. But do I think there is a generation gap? Well, yes and no. I think I would say, first of all, that we are witnessing changes, but the changes are not revolutionary. The changes are gradual or incremental. New technologies generally do not replace old technologies. Many new media forms use the forms and devices of old media. For many children and young people, and for many adults, our use of technology is pretty mundane. It's not spectacularly creative or empowering or liberating, or indeed spectacularly dangerous. It's fairly banal, fairly mundane. I think we know now from research that this idea of a big generation gap, of a big difference between the generations, is really overstated. In some cases, young people are the early adopters of technology, but in some cases, actually, it's older people. In fact, social networking now is being taken up. The biggest expansion is among older people. It was older people who took, first of all, to mobile phones and to microblogging, to Twitter. I think there's a danger of always seeing young people as being in the avant-garde of change here and overemphasizing the differences between generations. I think also we need to be careful when we think about young people of simply generalizing about them. That, in fact, when we look at young people, there are still significant inequalities, digital divides in terms of access to technology, which are a lot to do with social class. And those divides are still very significant, as one of the speakers this morning has already said. I think there's also a danger, as we talk about this generation gap, that we present young people as somehow spontaneously competent, that young people are all cyber kids, you know, they're automatically, naturally able to operate technology. Whereas, again, a lot of research tells us that young people find technology sometimes frustrating, often quite boring. They often struggle with technology just as many adults do. And I think finally there is also a danger in this idea that we get to the assumption that somehow young people are fascinated by technology in its own sake, that technology will make an enormous difference because of its power, its inherent power to motivate young people. Now, I think that may apply to a minority of young people, but actually most of them are really only interested in technology in terms of what it can do with them. They want to socialize, they want to pursue interests and hobbies and so on. Most of them are not interested in or motivated by technology as a thing in itself. So I think there are some good reasons for challenging and questioning this simple idea of a generation gap. Having said that, yes, there are changes, and I think it's important as we think about these changes to see changing relationships between generations in a bigger context. So if we look to social theory, We have arguments about increasing levels of individualization, increasing levels of mobility within society, social fragmentation. People talk about the risk society and so on. Contemporary social theory, some of the big themes in contemporary social theory are actually very relevant here. The idea also that young people's transition into adulthood is increasingly precarious. It's increasingly difficult for them to achieve an easy move from childhood into adulthood. The idea that identity, establishing identity, finding identity, is increasingly complex in the modern world, that we're increasingly having to regulate, to survey ourselves, that identity increasingly becomes a matter of performance, of self-representation, and it's open to challenge. So identity becomes something very fraught and complicated and difficult, and digital media play a part in these changes. And of course, we are also seeing societies that are more consumer-oriented, societies where media and mediation is everywhere. So there are much bigger changes within society, and we need to bear these changes in mind if we want to understand what is happening more specifically with young people and technology. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 10 words, 10 big themes that I hope will enable you to at least think about this relationship between young people and technology. And I think important to say that some of these themes are to do with technology itself, but they're also to do with culture, with society, with the economy. And I think we really need that broad, in the round understanding of what is happening here. Okay, so first, count the words. My first word is convergence. And convergence is often talked about as a technological phenomenon. It's about the fact that increasingly everything, newspapers included, are digital. And the smartphone is perhaps the most obvious manifestation of this convergence, this coming together of media and technologies. But I think it's important to say that convergence is also an economic phenomenon. So we're talking about multimedia, cross-media franchises. If we think about how media operate and how technologies operate in the modern world, if we think about the big players in this world, if we think about Facebook and Google and Apple and so on, and also about News International, we think in the UK about the BBC, increasingly there is this economic convergence, this economic coming together. We're thinking about media that cross and are available in multiple platforms through multiple franchises. And that means that convergence is not just technological, but also cultural. So increasingly, media texts are connected with other texts, this phenomenon of intertextuality. Every media text becomes a link in to other media texts. Every media text advertises another media text. So what we have is a kind of, and particularly I think if we think about children's culture, if we think about the successes of children's culture, Pokemon, Harry Potter, if we think about teen media, increasingly what we're seeing is this multimedia convergence, this synergy between different media. What that means also is apparent at the level of the consumer or the user. So we're talking about a proliferation of media rather than simply one medium displacing other media. We're talking about an increasingly wide repertoire of media choices. Television did not replace reading or the cinema. The internet has not replaced TV. Rather, what's happening is the repertoire of media choices is becoming bigger. What may be changing is the reasons why people use particular media, the context in which they use them. But in general, what is happening is a wider range of possibilities. And what is quite notable, perhaps particularly for young people, is then their ability to use media, multiple media, simultaneously, what's sometimes called multitasking. So we have statistics like these. 8 to 10-year-olds in the US spend 1/4 of their media time using multiple media. I suspect the figure is higher than that. You go into a teenager's bedroom and what you find is them using multiple windows on the computer. They've got things going on the smartphone, perhaps the TV is on, perhaps music is playing, and they're shifting from one medium to another. There are different ways of looking at this. I mean, you can say that on one level, this shows young people's incredible ability to handle multiple sources at the same time, what psychologists would call parallel processing. They're dealing with different information sources simultaneously. Other people would say, no, on the contrary, actually, this is all about distraction, that we can't pay attention anymore. We're constantly distracted. And certainly within the media industries, I like this idea of the attention economy, that one of the things that media companies are having to do is to struggle to gain our attention, that attention has become a commodity, something that needs to be captured and it can then be sold within the media marketplace. One other dimension of this is individualization. So we're talking about a context where access to media in the home and outside the home is increasingly individualized. So the days of family viewing have maybe not quite disappeared, but they're certainly declining. The idea that we used to have, people here may remember when we used to have one telephone shared among the family, you know, that idea has really disappeared. Young people have privatized, individualized access in the bedroom, as well as access through mobile devices. I think there's a paradox here, really, in terms of how adults relate to young people. On the one hand, you could say that that individualized, privatized access undermines adult authority and adult control. Parents are fearful of the dangers of the outside world, so increasingly what they do is to provide their children with a media-rich environment in the home. They want to keep them safe at home, and so they provide them with all this access to technology. But of course, they then use that technology in individual, private ways. And the argument is that parents no longer know what is happening here in ways that they could know when there was only one television, only one telephone in the house. So the argument would be that actually it's increasingly difficult, not just for parents to know what's happening, but also for them to understand what is happening. And that can generate anxiety in itself. What are our kids doing on the internet? How do we understand what's happening on those screens? Likewise with mobiles, I think. You can say that adults often buy mobile phones for their children in order to keep them safe, so they can keep track of where they are. And increasingly with phones now equipped with GPS, it's possible for parents to track where their children are at all times. So you could say, on the one hand, the technology allows for greater potential for surveillance and control by adults. But also, of course, it allows children to evade that control. They can speak or text without parents knowing who they're speaking to, where they are. They can do it at any time they like. So what we have with these technologies is a kind of paradox. On the one hand, you have a desire for parents to control and manage what their children are doing with media, and yet also the media provide children with possibilities to escape that control. And certainly with mobile phones, you have that idea of the phone used as GPS. One metaphor that people have used here that I quite like is the phone as a digital leash. You know, the leash you would use to take your dog for a walk. You pull on the leash and your child has to respond. So it's a complex dance of control and resistance going on here. Okay, so on the one hand we have individualization, but my next word, I think this is maybe number 4, is connection. A further paradox, that technologies that are increasingly individualized are also technologies that are keeping us much more intensively connected with others. Researchers who've looked at mobile phones talk about this as constant presence or constant connection. The idea, again, particularly strongly for young people, that we are expected to be constantly available, that we can and we should be in contact with people even when we're geographically distanced from them. For young people, it seems to be rude if you don't respond pretty immediately to an SMS or to a Facebook message. And even these stories of young people sleeping with the phone connected in case they're contacted. At the same time, this is not an easy world, and I think one thing that we see is that the hierarchies, the power plays that are always at stake in young people's peer culture are arguably intensified. Peer pressure becomes much more of an issue when you can be contacted at any time or in any place. So cyberbullying or sexting would be one manifestation of this. I think it's arguable whether there's any more bullying online than there used to be offline. But nevertheless, I think we can say that your place within the peer group, your place within the hierarchy, is often more precarious. There is often a more intensified pressure around how power works within the peer group than used to be the case when it was simply face-to-face. Having said that, and I think I will say a little more about this in a second, important to emphasize that all these means and channels of connection are commercial. So on one level, we're connecting with each other, but we're doing so in commercial platforms. Facebook exists because it makes money. And actually, the art for the people who produce these and sell these platforms is to connect, to embed the technology in the dynamics of the face group, in the dynamics of the peer group. So what is friendship all about? What does it mean to be a friend? Facebook has really got to work very hard to define what that is, to embed what it's doing, to embed those networks within the culture of the peer group. And it makes more money if it does so. So connection means profit to that extent. So again, different ways of looking at this. I mean, we can say, on the one hand, that this sense of constant connection is a positive development. Years ago, a man called Kenneth Gergen wrote a book called The Saturated Self. And I think he was quite positive about this idea that rather than being isolated individuals, we were now constantly, increasingly connected with each other. On the other hand, you have Sherry Turkle's book, which I'm sure you've seen, and if you haven't read the book, just go and look at the 15-minute TED Talk. She has a much more negative view of all of this, you know, that she argues that we're constantly distracted, we're never really there, we're never really here in the here and now, because we're always elsewhere. Okay, that then raises some questions, I think, about my term number 5, identification. I've called this identification rather than identity, because I want to suggest that identification, or the process of forming identity, is a process. It's not something that we either have or don't have. It's something that we constantly have to work to achieve. And I think we know already that the media are crucial in this process of identity formation. And I think you could argue that within media culture more generally now, the whole question of identity has become much more significant. If you think about celebrity culture, if you think about reality TV, if you think about makeover shows and so on, increasingly the whole question of who we are, how we construct and present ourselves is increasingly a preoccupation for different kinds of media. And the idea here would be that we are increasingly, as a result, involved in processes of self-surveillance, self-regulation. We are watching ourselves and we're constantly being watched by others. There are no private spaces anymore. Social success depends upon a kind of advertising of oneself. As I say, I think that's evident in many other areas of media, not just digital media, but if we look at social networking, it's very clear that identity is absolutely what the process is about. So it's about self-representation. And increasingly, again, what we find is that the companies who provide the platforms for this are offering us templates. They're offering us particular prescribed ways in which we can represent ourselves. These are not free and open spaces. They're spaces in which we are invited to define ourselves, but in very particular ways. If you think about how you frame your status on a platform like Facebook, how you are invited and how, you know, the questionnaire invites you to define yourself. You define yourself, for example, not least in terms of your consumer choices and your consumer preferences. So what we're seeing here is an intensification of this process of identification in the online space. And in that context, people have already spoken about this, the whole issue of publicness, publicity, the blurring of the boundary or the refiguring of the boundary between the public and the private becomes increasingly complex. Okay, I think I'm up to number 6 now. My next word is credibility. I think all of this focus on presentation, representation, leads to a concern, a related concern about what is true and false. How do we make judgments about what we see and hear through digital media? Academics frequently advise their students not to use Wikipedia. Personally, I'm not too convinced that Wikipedia is less reliable than print, but even so, you know, the internet may be a wonderful source of information, but it's also a medium for self-aggrandizement, a medium for rumor, a medium for conspiracy theory. There are big questions here about how we evaluate what we see, how we identify and assess the sources of that information. Very often in the case of Wikipedia and other online sources, the idea is that the community of contributors will somehow regulate itself. And there are very interesting questions then about how reputation works online, systems of establishing authority and credibility. How do those operate online? How do we know who to trust? How does the community operate to regulate, to ensure that the voices that get heard are the trustworthy voices? It's a process really of self-policing in which mediators are increasingly important. Big questions also about ethics and copyright. And at the end of the day, questions about how knowledge, information becomes knowledge. How do we make sense of the masses of information that are now available? How do we take that on board? How do we process it? So I think there are a series of difficult epistemological and ethical questions going on here about how we evaluate, how we know what to trust, and also, as part of that, what we understand about how information is produced. Many people see this in a very positive light, and they talk about participation. Optimistic advocates of digital media, participation is a feel-good word. I think there are different dimensions of participation. We might want to distinguish between the kind of everyday interaction we would have on Facebook from the more active forms of digital creativity that we might experience on YouTube, for example, when we're sharing user-generated content, blogging, microblogging, forms of civic and political participation, forms of internet activism. I think there's a bit of a problem if we just put all of this stuff together and call it participation. I'm going to say a little bit more later around citizenship and this whole idea of the civic sphere online and the role of the internet in all of that. There's a lot of talk, certainly, about user-generated content. And again, I think we need to be careful. There's a kind of ideological argument going on around the whole notion of Web 2.0, that in some ways we've moved into this more participatory media age. The masses have taken control. The people now have the power to generate media content. I think we need to be quite careful, not least to ask ourselves, you know, who is active in these spaces? A lot of this participation is actually about work of one kind or another. And when you look at who is involved in these digital spaces, who is participating, very often it's the usual suspects. It's people who are already privileged in other areas of their life. So there are big digital divides in terms of participation as well. A further reason to be careful about all of this is that it is, by and large, a commercial process. It's money that is driving it all. What we're finding is that youth, and now increasingly children, are an increasingly important target market. But there is a shift in how marketing is being conceived. We've seen, or we are seeing, the end of traditional mass marketing. Old-style advertising is now being overtaken by newer forms of marketing. So we're seeing the advent of personalized marketing, pervasive marketing, marketing that is everywhere, that's impossible to avoid, marketing that is often impossible to identify in the first place. If you think about how marketing operates on a platform like Facebook, very often marketers are involved even without us necessarily knowing. When we're invited to participate, we're being invited to contribute to participate in forms of marketing appeals. Now, the marketers will often say that this is all about empowerment, it's not about passive consumption, but it's clear that there are forms of embedded marketing, viral marketing, what's called co-creation going on here, in which people are very much involved as active participants, not just in making sense of marketing, but in distributing marketing messages, often in creating marketing messages. So what on one level people see as democratic and participatory is also simultaneously commercial. The tweeting, the tagging, the linking, the reviewing, the remixing, the gaming, all of this happens on corporate platforms. And of course these platforms are also important means of consumer surveillance. As we engage in these activities, they are also gathering information about us, and they are then selling that information to other people who are seeking to target us through this process of data mining. I think one can go a bit further and say actually this process also involves labor. It also involves work. And one of the interesting areas of research around digital media now is the so-called digital labor debate. I mean, one can look at this partly in terms of employment within the digital technology industries. And there is a growing literature on this from the Foxconn sweatshops, where actually computers like this one I'm using now are produced, through to the hipster technology companies. I've been very involved in what's happening now in East London, where you have new startup technology companies, companies for whom work is play and play is work, or at least this is the story. But one can argue that, in a way, the economic model has shifted. We've gone from a situation where, as people used to say, the media was the free lunch, that the media was about selling audiences to advertisers. Increasingly now, we have become not just consumers of media content, but also producers of media content in this commercial process. There's a kind of hidden labor going on here. There is work involved in how we generate content and put it up on Facebook, on YouTube, and so on. That in a way one can say that user-generated content is a form of free labor that allows the further generation of profit by media companies. I think this is term number 10, probably. My last word is inequality, because I think, following from what I've been saying just now, is that the tendency then of markets is to accentuate inequalities. I've done a lot of work in the last few years around the whole idea of the commercialization of childhood. People often talk about this in terms of this idea of consumerism, that somehow children are being seduced into a false ideology where they see everything in consumer terms. I would argue that actually the bigger problem here is not to do with consumerism, it's to do with inequality. If we look within societies, and certainly if we look globally, it's clear that there are still enormous digital divides, not so much divides in terms of access to technology, but certainly in terms of what we might call cultural capital, cultural literacy. The knowledge that we need to use technology is unevenly divided within society. And I think that happens both on a global level, but also within the peer group, that there are inequalities of knowledge within the peer group that actually play into the operations of power within young people's peer groups. Okay, that was my 10 points, but unfortunately that's not the end. And I know I have another kind of 10 or 15 minutes. So I want to come back to these terms, so literacy, learning, citizenship, media, and so on. What I've been trying to do really is to tell you a complicated story. I don't think it's about either or. I don't think young people are being magically empowered by this technology, nor do I think that they are being somehow enslaved or exploited. It's actually complicated, and I want to move on in this last bit to talk a bit about media literacy as policy and education and also citizenship. I think in all of this it's important to say that there are limits to what government can do, that we often look to government to give us the answers to any problems that may be arising. And I think in the contemporary world there are limits to what government can do, because in a way technology is all the time escaping the ability to control it. But in a neoliberal world order, there are also limits to what government wants to do. Here and in the UK, across the world, we have governments that are fundamentally committed to the operation of the free market, to abandoning ideas of publicness and the public sphere. And so what we have is, on the one hand, a government that will talk about and mobilize fears of social collapse, fears about childhood being under threat in particular. Childhood becomes a political symbol in this world. There are fears about change, fears about the loss of innocence, fears about damage and risk to childhood. And media are often seen to be crucially important in this. Media are the agents of modernity that are really destroying childhood. And increasingly there is talk about protection and safety, and within schools, I think, a return to a much more authoritarian mode of operation. The focus very much on the regulation and control of children. And we can see this in media policy, in cultural policy, and in education policy. So we have that, but at the same time, there are limits to what government wants to do. There are limits to what government can possibly do in terms of regulating and controlling technology. So for government, from a policy point of view, this is a very difficult double-edged situation. Media literacy, people already mentioned Ofcom, and we have had in the UK, we have had education about media going back probably 70 years. Certainly we can look back to the 1960s and we can see a lot of evidence of people teaching about media in schools. We've had established courses about media in schools since the 1970s. Lots of children will study media both as a specialist subject and also as part of their general literacy education within the mother tongue language, English. What happened about 10 years ago, a bit more than that, was that the government, after spending a very long time trying to ignore this, denigrating this, suddenly discovered the idea of media literacy. And as it created a new body called Ofcom, this is Ofcom's very fancy building in London, just by the river, it created a new media regulator. And what we saw was, for those of us who've been around for a very long time, what we saw was a very strange enthusiasm for media education, or more particularly for media literacy. Here we had a government minister, the Minister of Culture, Tessa Jowell, at the time, a little more than 10 years ago. She said, "I believe in the modern world, media literacy will become as important a skill as maths or science. Decoding our media will be as important to our lives as citizens as understanding great literature is to our cultural lives. And I remember being there when she gave this speech and thinking, what is happening here? You know, we've spent so long feeling like we're on the margins, and suddenly the government is telling us this story. We had a Communications Act, a new law in 2003 that created Ofcom. It was part of a bigger change in media regulation. And I think it's important to say that it was broadly a shift towards a free market model. It was partly about the government's addressing new technology, but it was also about the government creating more space for a free market, or a so-called free market, a more commercial market in communications. Where does media literacy fit into this? Well, I think there is an argument for saying that the government effectively was backing off. The government was saying, we need to leave the market to do what the market does. We need to leave the market to provide media and communications. There are problems here. There are risks at stake in that process. But the answer is not for the government to control people. The answer is for people to control themselves, for people to regulate themselves. So we see a move from government regulation to citizens' self-regulation, or more precisely, to use the term that Ofcom used, citizen consumers' self-regulation. And for Ofcom, really the citizen was a consumer. Consumers would regulate themselves. And that's where media literacy comes in. I think we can argue that the government suddenly discovers media literacy because it sees media literacy as a way of encouraging people to regulate themselves, to be responsible for their own behaviour and their own conduct in this new media landscape. Now, there is much to say about media literacy, and I could tell you another story. I think there's a very interesting story, and I've written about this, and you can find stuff online, about the whole policy process. You know, what goes on here? You know, people suddenly start talking about this word media literacy, and then they're not clear about what it means. They want it to serve lots of different purposes. I think one thing that was very clear from the beginning was that really this was an initiative from communications policy. It was about communications and media policy. The media policy makers never really spoke to anybody in education policy. So media literacy never gets taken up by people within education policy who've got all sorts of other concerns that they're worrying about. What happens over the 6-7 years following the Communications Act is that basically media literacy becomes narrower and narrower. So those of us who, with a background in media education, were thinking, oh, this is all about citizenship, this is all about culture, this is all about critical thinking. Actually, in the end, media literacy becomes to be about child safety and e-inclusion. Media literacy comes to be the answer to the problem of what do we do about pornography on the internet? How do we make sure that everybody completes their tax return online? Well, the answer is that they need to be media literate. So what we find is the agenda, the definition of media literacy becomes narrower and narrower. And for me, all the interesting questions I would want to ask gradually disappear from the agenda. This absurd kind of preoccupation with internet safety really becomes the dominant emphasis when it comes to children. And by the time we get to 2009, this report, Digital Britain, comes out, and it refers to media literacy, and it says, media literacy is a technocratic specialist term understood by policymakers, but not really part of everyday language. Basically, media literacy is finished as a policy initiative. Okay, I'm aware of my 5 minutes or so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit here. Okay, I'm going to talk about citizenship, and then I will finish. So I think the story of media literacy is really rather a sorry story. In the meanwhile, we've seen a massive push to insert technology in education. I think it's a push that's driven by government, but also driven by commercial companies. That commercial companies increasingly have come to see schools and formal education as a market that they're wanting to move into. And one consequence of that, insofar as people in education are thinking about media literacy, they're thinking about it as digital literacy, and they're thinking about digital literacy in very limited terms. They're thinking about digital literacy as a means of teaching children the basics of how technology works. So there's a lot of technology in schools, but actually the use of technology in schools is very instrumental. The teaching about it is very much reduced to learning how to use a web browser, learning file management and spreadsheets. It's very narrow, very limited. Any of the critical questions that we might want to ask about media and the ways in which technology is implicated with popular culture, those questions don't really come onto the agenda at all. Okay, citizenship. I think in some ways, just as we have a lot of hope around technology in education, we also have a hope around citizenship. And there is the idea that somehow technology will perform a magic trick here. One of the concerns, and it's a concern we're seeing now, we have an election coming in about 3 weeks' time. And one of the big concerns is to do with what is often called the digital disconnect, that young people are disaffected from politics. There is a democratic deficit, that young people are not involved and not interested in politics, and so technology will address this problem. Technology will fix the problem. The internet will save democracy. And so you have people arguing very much that, the internet provokes new forms of participation, but also, I would say, new forms of surveillance of individual behavior. One of the ironies here is that we have activists who are very much involved in the online space. And for activists, for political activists of very different kinds, I would say the internet is valuable for left, liberal, environmental movements. It's also extremely valuable for fascists and racists. But those groups are looking to the internet as a way of building new networks. Meanwhile, this same technology that is seen to be liberating and empowering in political terms is also technology that allows people, the government, authorities, to monitor and survey people's behavior. And the Edward Snowden revelations give us a very clear indication of the potential scale of that kind of surveillance. I did a project a few years ago about digital citizenship, which is in this book called The Civic Web. And we looked at civic websites. We looked at the kind of explosion of civic, citizenship-oriented material, NGOs, governments, activists, and so on, online. And I think what we found in this book was there was a lot of use of technology, but technology did not provide a magic solution. Technology was good for activists, but actually, if you're trying to engage people who are not already engaged in politics and in civil society, technology really isn't going to be the answer. Technology is not a push medium, but a pull medium. It's very good for serving people who already know what they want, who already know what they're looking for, who are already participating. But for people who are not participating, the internet is probably less useful than using old media such as television. We found that organizations were spending a lot of money on websites, making these very fancy interactive websites, but what you found was the phenomenon of the empty forum, the phenomenon of zero comments. People would be putting content up, inviting people to engage, and nobody was engaging. So interactivity, the creation of opportunities to interact, does not in itself produce interaction. And what we found was a fairly traditional finding in lots of ways, that what motivates participation is not technology. What motivates people to become active citizens, to be involved in the civic sphere, is mostly to do with what happens offline, mostly also often to do with issues that are happening in their immediate neighborhood. They're not necessarily about bigger issues. Okay, I've been rushing a bit at the end, and this is the last slide. So I'm going to leave you with a few questions. Firstly, my first question is, well, you know, is digital really new here? I mean, we know, I think, the purpose of media education. Does the advent of digital media really mean that we have to think very differently? Is digital media education really so different and so new? Or can we not just bring in perspectives from older forms of media education and develop and extend them here? Okay, yes, we need media literacy, but there is a big question, I think, about what kind of media literacy we really need and why. When I look at a lot of the things that people now do in the name of media literacy, look at what regulators are doing in the name of media literacy, it seems to me very much about making children well behaved, making children safe. It's actually very, very limited. It's making children good little citizens. It's all about producing docile, well-behaved children. All of that critical edge, that sense of opposition, that was one of the big reasons why I got into media education, a lot of that has disappeared. Media education has, or media literacy, has become very bland. Can digital citizenship really make up for the limitations of non-digital, ordinary citizenship? We think there is a crisis in citizenship, in democracy. Is technology really going to be the answer? And if technology is the answer, then perhaps the question was pretty stupid in the first place. Yes, there's a danger if we ask stupid questions that we end up with stupid answers. And for me, very often, technology is a stupid answer to a stupid question. And at that point, I will finish. Thank you.
Sem ter combinado com o professor David, eu dei-lhe os meus 5 minutos de comentário. Enquanto membro da organização, acho que posso prescindir deles, e damos então a palavra ao professor António Granado para o seu comentário.
Bem, muito obrigado. Muito obrigado pelo convite. Eu acho que é extremamente difícil comentar uma palestra como esta, onde foram levantadas tantas questões sobre a literacia mediática e onde o professor David Buckingham faz algo que não é normal, que é questionar a própria retórica da literacia mediática, ou seja, levantar-nos uma série de questões sobre se estamos ou não estamos a criar cidadãos bem comportados quando lhes estamos a tentar ensinar como é que eles se devem portar nas redes sociais, como é que eles devem atuar cada vez que utilizam a internet, etc. E houve várias coisas que o professor disse durante esta palestra que me fizeram, digamos, levantar ainda mais algumas questões. E eu acho que valia a pena também depois ouvir o público e ouvir as questões que o público tem para fazer. Este ano, a geração que entrou na universidade, pode parecer estranho para alguns aqui, mas a geração que entrou na universidade é a geração de 1996. São os nascidos em 1996. A internet comercial começou em 1995. Portanto, quem entrou este ano na universidade sempre viveu com a internet. E é uma das dificuldades que eu acho que nós temos ao nível do ensino universitário, é perceber até que ponto é que estes jovens, então aqueles que estão a ensinar jornalismo, como é o meu caso, até que ponto é que estes jovens, até que ponto é que faz algum sentido propostas como a partilha de jornais dentro dos espaços universitários, a partilha de jornais gratuitos dentro dos espaços universitários. Estamos perante uma geração que lê muito mais do que as gerações anteriores, certamente lê muito mais, certamente tem acesso a muitíssimo mais informação, mas também certamente está muito menos interessada em ler notícias escritas em jornais. Depois houve uma outra questão que o professor levantou e que é a questão da convergência, e que eu acho que também, de alguma forma, esta questão da convergência está a afetar o próprio negócio dos média, onde eu tive muitos anos. há uma convergência também, se podemos falar assim, há uma convergência entre os produtores de informação e os consumidores de informação. Os consumidores de informação produzem agora muitíssimo mais informação e isso, digamos, é um perigo. Os órgãos de comunicação social tradicionais, onde eu próprio trabalhei, veem isso como um problema. E por isso é que, apesar de irem lá beber muitas das informações que publicam, algumas das informações mais interessantes publicadas nos últimos tempos sobre alguns casos mediáticos foram publicadas primeiramente em blogs e foram publicadas por cidadãos. Aliás, o caso que envolve, por exemplo, para dar só um exemplo, o caso que envolve o Presidente da Câmara de Lisboa e a casa na Avenida da Liberdade foi publicado num blog na íntegra. Toda a investigação foi publicada num blog antes de saltar para os órgãos de comunicação social. E, portanto, parece-me que esta coincidência entre os produtores de informação e aqueles que tradicionalmente eram vistos como os detentores da verdade e os detentores da informação, que são neste caso os jornalistas, também é algo que nós devíamos discutir um pouco. Outra questão que me foi levantada, foram levantadas muito mais, mas eu vou falar só de mais duas. Uma das questões que me foi levantada pela intervenção do professor Buckingham foi a questão quando ele falou do multitasking e da forma como os jornais, os órgãos de comunicação social, esta questão do multitasking e de ir buscar informações a todos os lados. Eu não sei como é que vocês consomem os vossos meios de comunicação social, qual é que é a vossa dieta mediática. Fala-se muito de dieta mediática agora. Eu consumo parte da minha dieta mediática em aplicações que preparam a dieta mediática para mim. Ou seja, que recolhem informação sobre determinados temas que me interessam mais e, portanto, eu a certa altura não sei exatamente se estou a ler uma notícia do Guardian, se estou a ler uma notícia do Atlantic, se estou a ler uma notícia do Washington Post. E esta pulverização também vem dificultar enormemente o próprio funcionamento dos órgãos de comunicação social, dos média, que veem os seus artigos pulverizados. A verdade é esta, há uma pulverização enorme dos artigos na web, muitas vezes há sites que a única coisa que fazem, há sites em Portugal que o fazem, não é? Há um exemplo de um site em português chamado Notícias ao Minuto, que vocês devem conhecer, que é provavelmente dos sites mais partilhados do Facebook e que não tem qualquer informação original. Zero. Produzem zero informação original. A única coisa que eles fazem é vão a um site, o Jornal de Negócios hoje tem uma grande notícia, reproduzem a notícia do Jornal de Negócios, escrevem-na eles próprios e dizem, citam o Jornal de Negócios, até fazem um link para o Jornal de Negócios, para não lhes poderem ser acusados de estarem a plagiar, mas a verdade é que não produzem qualquer informação original, apenas servem da necessidade de partilhar nas redes sociais e grande parte da informação que agora, grande parte do tráfego que os órgãos de comunicação social recebem vem também da internet. E estas últimas questões que o professor levantou, aquela que me preocupa mais é provavelmente aquela sobre como e o que exatamente nós devemos estar preocupados em ensinar no que diz respeito à literacia mediática aos nossos estudantes. É evidente que para estudantes de jornalismo o que eu normalmente digo é que o jornalista, digamos, o seu único valor de um jornalista vem do seu nome profissional e, portanto, o que eu lhes digo é que atenção ao vosso nome profissional, atenção à forma como utilizam o vosso nome profissional nas redes sociais. You will be googled. Vocês vão ser googlados e as pessoas vão encontrar a vossa informação, vão encontrar os vossos portfólios, vão encontrar a informação que vocês colocarem online, os vossos artigos jornalísticos, e isso pode ser interessante para o vosso futuro, mas era interessante também percebermos de que forma é que esta geração, eu sinto, eu lá em casa neste momento só tenho uma adolescente, eu tenho 4 filhos, os outros já são maiores, e tenho uma adolescente, e a verdade é que a verdade é que, digamos, os conselhos que eu lhes fui dando ao longo do tempo na utilização das redes sociais foram extremamente escassos. Sinto isso e sinto que os jovens não têm muita noção daquilo que devem ou que não devem fazer online e também, ao mesmo tempo, de que forma é que podem contribuir para esta outra face da literacia mediática, que não é só esta ideia de serem bem comportados, é também de produzirem algo que seja interessante para o resto da sociedade. Eu gostei muito da conferência, quer dizer, daria para estarmos aqui a falar durante muito tempo. Eu peço desculpa da intervenção ser em português, mas visto haver tradutores, acho que é mais fácil para mim falar em português.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. How internet or technology can serve us to become the web citizens? It would be interesting to hear more about that, because there are initiatives of civic hacking and trying to include contents about how to use technology to be a more participative citizen. And I think that would be, that look at the future would be like the good practices that are being done in the world. That's something that maybe you could share something about it with us. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, I was going very fast at that point, and it's a whole other story, I think. I mean, when we did our research for that book, we were really looking at a point of transition from Web 1.0 to Web 2.0. I don't think I believe in that distinction, really, but and a lot of Web 1.0 is still there. A lot of those websites that we looked at are still there. I have to say, I find it all a very ambivalent process, really. I think on the one hand, there are enormous possibilities for people to engage online, but I would still maintain, I think the problem is that very often people who are doing this they're preaching to the converted, we would say. They're preaching to people who are already active. And if you're already active in a political movement, there are great opportunities. There are also great opportunities for the government to observe what you're doing, and that's maybe a problem too. But I think the real challenge, in a way, is how do we engage people, probably the majority of people, who don't really know about politics or civic, social issues, and more to the point, are not really bothered about them. Yes? So again, in the UK, we have an election coming. There is this concern about young people don't vote. I actually think young people have very good reasons often for not voting. That not voting is an indication of a lack of faith in conventional, traditional politics. And I don't think that we should blame young people for being alienated from traditional politics. I think the problem is with traditional politics and not necessarily with young people, yes? In a way, I suppose I would say that the problem is that we've started with a stupid question. Can the internet save democracy? You know, can the internet solve the problem of democracy? I think we actually need to look at democracy, or we need to look at existing political systems and understand what is wrong with existing political systems before we start looking to technology as the answer to that problem. Yeah? So in a way, my my response is to say, or what I've tried to do, certainly in that research, is to ask the question the other way round, to ask a different question. Yeah? But you should read the book.
Yes.
Só mais uma.
Rápido.
Yeah, but then they can't hear you and they can't translate.
Yes.
Good morning. I'm now beginning to study media literacy. I'm more focused on adult media literacy. And as far as I know, you are more interested on children. I would like to know why children, and what is your perspective about how we can approach media literacy to adults?
Yes, I think your first question is a really good question. And it's a question I often ask myself. Because I think always there is an assumption that if children need media literacy, then children are the problem. And of course, a lot of the rhetoric about young people and technology almost suggests the opposite. It almost suggests that children actually know everything and adults are really the problem. Adults don't know about this. Again, I don't think it's either or. I think there are a lot of things that children don't know and understand about new media, yes? And equally, I think there are a lot of things that adults do understand about new media. So I think this, in a way, the distinction, children know nothing and they need media literacy because we need to protect them. It's always us, we have the answer, that we will give them the answer and then they will be enlightened. It's a very traditional view of education, which maybe in this case is quite questionable, yes? I mean, there is a lot of work about adult media literacy that I do know less about. I mean, I'm an educator more concerned with children and with training teachers who teach children. My feeling is that always there is a problem that you have to address here, which applies to children as well as adults, which is, why does anybody want to learn about this in the first place? Because we can decide from the outside, these people need media literacy. These people are lacking in media literacy and we need to give them the knowledge. But I think there is a real question, and perhaps particularly with adults, and particularly with older adults. It's older adults who are often seen to be the big problem here. Older adults have less access to technology. There's often an assumption that this is a problem and they should be using these media. If people who are 60 plus, if they're not online, they should be online. Well, maybe, but what's at stake in that kind of moral imperative that they should be online? Why would they want to be online? And why would they then want, why do they need media literacy? What do they understand to be their needs? And I think one of the problems with the whole media literacy argument is that it's premised on the idea that there are these people who are illiterate, who are lacking in literacy. I think we need to ask the question, why do they, what is their motivation? What is their need? And try to ask the question that way round. And I think that then is a question for adults, and particularly for older adults, as well as it's a question for children.
Muito obrigado, Professor David Buckingham. Foi prazer tê-lo connosco e vamos continuar a poder conversar com ele mais tempo. Vamos aos trabalhos de grupo, passando eventualmente ali pelo sítio onde se pode pegar num cafezinho. Até já.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.